got a really exciting double feature of both a talk by Dr Helen Nichols, who's Senior Criminology Lecturer here at the university, responding to our Counterpoints exhibition of work by Paul G. Hughes. So considering these grey works, Helen is going to be talking about the grey spaces that crop up in her world of criminology. And following that, we have a performance by Yol, who is bringing you sounds that were originally recorded or produced or performed in Red Gallery, which is an organisation that Paul Hughes set up, and thinking about that as a lost space, as a grey space. So, first of all, I'd really like to hand over to Helen, and we're really excited to hear what Helen's got to say, and then we'll be having a discussion afterwards. So, welcome, Helen.
I'm excited to see what I've got to say. So first of all, thank you so much, Sarah, for inviting me. I only met Sarah, when was it, a couple of months ago?
Yeah.
But I feel like we've become besties already. When Sarah was talking to me about this exhibition, there were already things that I was starting to identify in the way that we think about certain spaces of criminal justice. And then Sarah popped my name on a leaflet, and here I am. So I said to one of our colleagues in criminology, Emily, this morning, that I'm terrified because I don't score art. And she said, art is all interpretation, and it will all make sense. So thank you, Emily, for saying that, because I'm just going with that right now. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk to you about time and liminality in the carceral space. Now, when we think of carceral spaces, we kind of tend to automatically think about prisons, but actually what we mean by carceral can be both physical in relation to places of detention, but it can also be a kind of psychological and ontological experience of incarceration. And actually here at the university we have a Cultures of Incarceration Research Centre, which brings together academics from a range of different disciplines to explore what we mean by the carceral. So just to give you an introduction to where I sit within that, I'm a senior lecturer in criminology, but my specialism is prisons research. So I'm technically a penologist, which means I study punishment. But I have a particular interest in contemporary adult male imprisonment, and for the majority of my career to date, which has been like 14 years or so, I've mainly looked at education in the prison environment, and that has involved doing research on education in prison in a variety of different prisons, both high security and also category C training prisons. But then immediately after I did my doctoral work, rather than setting about publishing from my thesis, mainly because I couldn't look at it for 5 years because PhDs are challenging times, I thought I need to take my research findings about education in prison and all these things that I'm preaching about why it's so important, and I need to put my money where my mouth is. I need to go into prison, deliver education, and actually see if it has these broader benefits that I'm saying it has beyond employability. So I've taught in prison in high security. Some of the best work that students of mine have ever produced have come from those convicted of murder, multiple murder and terrorism and high profile drug trafficking offences. So I'll leave that with you to interpret what that means, but it was a wonderful experience. More recently though, I've been actually looking at other populations in prison because my focus has primarily been people serving sentences, but we have to acknowledge that prisons are societies within themselves, and you have a population of people both living and working in them. And what's become really acutely clear to me over the course of my academic career to date is that actually prisons are places of trauma, and prisons are kind of, I always feel like they're this living, breathing thing that does something to people. And when I'm in prison, I kind of feel that it's palpable that these places are sites of trauma that are constantly doing something to those people within them. So my recent research has looked at the well-being of prison governors, so those people who manage prisons, But then also I've worked on a project most recently with my colleague Josephine Metcalf, where we delivered creative writing classes to prison staff for the purposes of wellbeing and reflection. So what's been good about this in terms of my career today is that I've been able to now get a bit of balance. It's very difficult in social science research not to start taking sides and to develop empathy with the people who we do research with and the people we're trying to understand. And so to mitigate that, I think it's been really helpful for me to really understand the prison experience from both the lived experience and then the work experience perspective. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. But in relation to today's session, I suppose it's the more kind of prison sociologist side of me that you will see come out. Also the AS level art side of me, which you will see in my attempt to bring some art into this presentation. Be nice, if I get it totally wrong, be nice. I won't know. So the counterpoint today, I went back to the brief and picked up these three words that were presented in the brief. The counterpoint is really highlighting grey areas, crossroads, and this sense of not knowing. And that speaks volumes in just those three key points about how we can kind of articulate what prisons are like. And really interestingly, when I first saw the logo for the exhibition, the first thing that I thought about was a prison. So this is a picture of HMP Manchester. You may recognise it more commonly as Strangeways. You may recognise it more commonly if there were little people sat on top of it chucking the tiles off in 1990. But you can see here how the prison has a natural counterpoint in this kind of design. Not all prisons are designed like this, but it just felt like there must be something to say about this space and this idea of crossroads coming together, and especially of not knowing. So I'm going to try and be as concise as I can, which is why I've prepared slides, because I'll probably go off on one if I didn't. And try and interpret what I think we mean by grey spaces in prison as a non-artist, as a penologist. So I thought I'd talk about this in relation to time and liminality. And in order to explain liminality, I first have to explain time. Not that you don't know what time is, but starting off by refreshing ourselves on what we mean by time, how we conceive of time, and also how we articulate time, to then translate that into what that means during a period of incarceration. So drawing on Wahidin's work, she highlights that we have these kind of spatial metaphors to help us conceive of time as being something invisible, untouchable, inaudible, so it's something we really can't tangibly get hold of, but something that is part of everything. So very much like the air around us, we know it's there, we know all those atoms are flying about all over the place, still don't know what one looks like. They're there, but we can't see them, we can't touch them, we can't hear or smell. So there's a really clear separation then between a kind of sensory experience and how we experience time. It's not experienced in that way. And we also talk about time throughout our daily lives. We talk about time in terms of what time is it in the clock. We might refer to times in relation to the seasons. And we also talk about time in terms of how we experience that, whether it's good, bad, positive, negative. There's the so-called right time, which I don't know what that is, but apparently there is a right time for things, or at least maybe older conceptions of what the right time is or should be are more concrete than they are now. And we also have some understanding about time in the way that it has an impact on us. So even though it's something that we can't sensorially experience, so there's touch or smell or sound, it can take its toll on us in lots of different ways. So time is really this all-encompassing thing that interacts with us all the time in our daily lives in lots and lots of different ways. Now, one of the interesting things about time when we're thinking about punishment is that time is actually a mechanism for punishment, particularly when we're looking at custodial sentences in prison. And it's kind of suggested that this is a fair mechanism of punishment if we look at it in the sense of the ownership of time. So if we're thinking about prison as a time-based punishment, then arguably, regardless of your economic wealth or lack thereof, you are experiencing the same deprivation. So because the rich and the poor have this or are able to experience this thing in the same way, then it's a fair system. That this time is taken away from whoever is given that kind of sentence. So Matthew says, what therefore could be more reasonable than that those who transgress the law should be given a forward punishment whose effects would be experienced equally by all. Now, you're probably thinking, that's probably not the case. We know that the justice system isn't necessarily fair to everybody, especially if we look at that in relation to economic status. But that is a different lecture for a different time. Come and do a criminology degree, we'll talk about it. So yeah, there is a lot wrong with this, but I know that and you know that. But for the purpose of understanding what time punishment means and looks like and feels like, then again, going back to Wahidin's work, she talks about the essence of time punishment being about time taken away that cannot be recaptured. Something being taken away that you will definitely not get back. And that has implications for not just the time that you're spent in that place, but the things that you cannot do physically in the community during that period. But, almost like a distortive effect, being in confinement actually distorts the way in which time is experienced. So when in prison, time is not necessarily experienced in the same way that it is in the free community because of the impact of that confinement, and also because of a lack of control over one's own autonomy and decision making within that regime. So we can't expect time to be experienced in the same way because of the constraints that are placed on the individual. And so time in incarceration sense is considered to be wasted rather than spent. So we think about in the free community what we spend our time doing almost as if it's a transactional choice. So I'm choosing to do this with my time, and my cost for that is a transactional giving away of my time coupons, if you like. But in prison you don't have that autonomy and control over what you do. So you are subservient to a regime that governs your every move. Despite the fact that some of the more boisterous men I've interviewed in prison tell me that they do what they want, when I say, okay, walk out that door, and they realise, oh, I can't do that, I didn't mean that, you really actually have zero control over what you do. The regime dictates when you go to bed, it dictates when you eat, it dictates when you sleep, it dictates when you work. And if you choose not to do those things, so if you choose not to engage in work or education, you can spend 23 hours a day in your cell. So there is really no possibility to spend in a transactional way your time in a way of your own choosing. Now, I got an E in AS level art, and I'm not letting it go. I thought there was good stuff in my work, so I'm bringing it back. I'm not bitter about it at all. It's fine. They obviously just didn't understand what I was going for. But like every other person my age who did art at school, I loved Salvador Dali. Who didn't? Like, I need to pick someone who, I don't know, is not that obvious, but I'm going with the old me. I'm not going to do a disservice to her. It's fine. 20 years on, and I'm totally over it. Anyway, so when thinking about some of this stuff in relation to, let's call it carceral time, this was actually when I was writing my first book, based on my doctoral work on education in prison, and I had a section in it talking about the extent to which education actually can help people in prison to make good use of their time, so to spend it rather than waste it. And it got me thinking about The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali, an artist that no one's heard of, only I'd heard of him when I was doing my A-levels. You're welcome. And it got me thinking, does this help me to articulate in any way what prison time looks like? Because I always find, whether it's through teaching or through writing, that if I can create a visual to explain something, it helps to articulate it. It's for my purposes to be able to articulate it to people more clearly than I might do otherwise. And so we're looking into this with the powers of Google. It said that there were key symbolic elements in this piece, whereby the clocks in the piece were symbolising the erratic passage of time while dreaming, difficulty in keeping track of time while asleep, and also that time is irrelevant when we're asleep. So it's talking about this dreamlike state, and through that process of dreaming and being asleep, the meaning of time changes, and arguably it diminishes. Now the ants, the teeny tiny ants, symbolise decay. So I was thinking about this and thinking, can I articulate carceral time in this way? And essentially, I think we can, and I think it's really helpful. And I realised that if we just swap out the idea of dream and sleep with incarceration, it really helps to capture what we talk about in prison sociology and penology in relation to how time is experienced in prison. So it becomes the erratic passage of time while incarcerated. That might be erratic at some times, but then it might slow down. So I kind of think that rather than being erratic in terms of speed and pace, it's the unpredictable nature of how, or the distorted nature of how time is experienced as a passage. Difficulty keeping track of time when incarcerated, that's a reality. It is difficult to keep track of time, especially in prisons where there aren't many windows. So one of the classrooms that I taught in prison had windows that went onto a corridor. So there was absolutely zero natural light in our room, and it was really difficult to keep track of time. I didn't realise how much I relied on natural light just to have a sense of where am I during the day. And finally, time is irrelevant when we're incarcerated. And this really speaks to what the prison sociology literature says about time being wasted rather than spent, not having relevance or purpose or value. So for me, even if Google was lying to me and telling me what the picture actually symbolises, it might be something completely different. Either way, I think it's a really helpful way to capture and articulate and to visualise what time in prison can feel like. So we've kind of covered the time stuff, and I acknowledge that time in prison can be experienced in a variety of ways, arguably all of which are quite negative and distorted. And it kind of gets us thinking about this being a period of feeling like one is in limbo. And again, we have terminology for this in the social sciences, and we apply the concept of liminality to explain this feeling of being in limbo, or being in a suspended animation, or being, some people refer to it as being in stasis, like cryogenically frozen in terms of time passage. But liminality helps us to conceive of this, and it was actually a concept developed in 1908. And this concept explains that when an individual experiences a life course transmission, they change status and they must be separated from their previous position within the social structure. They must then occupy a liminal space, so this period of time in liminality, in limbo, in suspension and stasis, which disengages them from both their past and future roles. So physically or figuratively being cut off from both the past and the present, and being in this liminal place. Now eventually that person will be incorporated into the new. Eventually, when we're going through one of these life course transmissions, we will essentially reattach ourselves and be able to carry on with what the next stage of our life is. But arguably, when a person is in prison, they are experiencing an extended period of liminality, especially if they're serving a long prison sentence. So the kinds of life course transitions that would be referred to in that initial literature were the ideal symbolic rituals, I guess, of 1908. So you get a job, you get married, you raise a family, you retire, and then you die. That's the life course. It's awful when you look at it like that. But the transitions that are being discussed are these transitions from one of these points to the next. So when a person raises a family and then experiences that transition of going into retirement, they have to detach themselves from both the raising the family part and the retirement part before they then are ready to move on to the retirement fully. It's almost kind of acceptance of the past is gone, the future is coming, and now I'm willing to engage with that. Now, it's really important to note that this is dated. So we know that life doesn't look like this anymore. You can if you want it to, it doesn't have to if you don't want it to. We all know that, but it's really important, especially because it's being recorded, that people don't think that I suggested that this is life and what it looks like. Maybe Mary Poppins invented this. It's very Disney, Mary Poppins. But more recently, academic commentators have been talking about these ideas of life course transitions and articulated them in really impactful ways. And for example, Yvonne Dukes says that macroeconomic, social and political changes have resulted in demographic fluidity, and ideas about the right time have thankfully become increasingly flexible and individualised. Nonetheless, events which interrupt the anticipated chronology of life, so what it is that we anticipate our life has in store for us, whether it's any of these things, none of these things, whatever order we want, can be experienced as a profound assault on the self and can create relationships with significant others that dramatically diverge from the ideal. So regardless of what the modern life course looks like, these transitions still happen. But the impact that it has on us when something interrupts our expected next step is described, and I really like this terminology, as an assault on the self. You feel the kind of physical imagery, and we all know what that feels like when something happens that is life-changing, is disruptive, is unexpected, and actually changes what we think is going to happen next. It does feel like a psychological and emotional assault. But in the prison context, what does this look like in terms of the consequence of a disruptive life course? So what does that disruption, which of course is being given a custodial sentence, look like in the context of the prisoner? So Sapsford said that the loss of a marker to locate the self within the social world is the primary thing that impacts the experience for the prisoner. So by going to prison, they lose the ability to mark or place where they are in society. Kind of like, you know, when you're on Google Maps and there's that little yellow guy and you can drop him and plonk him. They lose the yellow guy, so I can no longer position myself in society. I'm not there anymore. I don't have a place. I don't know where to situate myself. So prison, in this sense, and that dislocation from the social world can be experienced as unemployment. It can be experienced in terms of identity stripping, so it might be a work identity that the person is then deprived of. It might be certain social status that they're deprived of, and other avenues that they may have previously had for developing social and cultural capital. And also, as previously mentioned in relation to time, the loss of clear time structure chronologically deprives meaning. So as you can imagine, the feeling of purpose and self-control becomes very diminished. A person's purpose in the world around them, their identity as a citizen is called into question, especially in this country. We're not kind of progressive like Norway, where their prisoners are viewed as citizens who just happen to be in a different place. Our citizens in prison are offenders, prisoners, monsters, and all that stuff that the Daily Mail really likes to talk about. So liminal spaces then have clear characterisations. They act as a boundary zone where a group of individuals or an environment becomes very distinguished or separated from another. And to kind of get a sense of the feeling of what it's like to be in a liminal space, and again, I'm 100% sure that all of us have been in our own liminal spaces, they're characterised by that feeling of fear, of uncertainty, vulnerability, chaos, ontological danger, that feeling of almost, the feeling in your gut that is unsettling, that you are not safe in this space and in a variety of ways. And this kind of sense of instability can be experienced in lots of different total institutions. So yes, it can be experienced, of course, in prisons, because that's what I'm talking about today. But you might also assimilate these kinds of feelings to other kinds of liminal space, like a hospital waiting room, where you're waiting for the results and wondering whether something awful is going to happen. The doctor's waiting room. These spaces are all separated. They separate you from the doctor's office, the future part. They separate you from the outside world, the past part. So we all experience liminal space in our own ways. But of course, the prison as a whole institution is a liminal space. And as a society within and of itself, it is an entire society's worth of liminality, or perhaps what we might connect to this exhibition as being a place of grey space. Now this is something that I saw in my doctoral research, which seems like it was a really long time ago now. So 12 years ago when I was collecting data when I did my PhD. Something that I always kept coming back to when thinking about time and liminality and liminal space, and now I'm always going to refer to it as grey space, was an interview that I had with a young lad called James, and I think he was the same age as me at the time. So at the time, what year is it? I was like, 26? And he was the same age as me. And during the interview, he talked about really experiencing this distinct waste of life. He wished that the first time he went to prison, this was his second time, he wished it had been longer so it had more severe an impact on him, so he would have been more deterred. So he was really full of regret, but so conscious, so conscious of life going on without him. And it was almost palpable that he felt trapped and isolated, and that he knew everyone else in the outside world is getting on with their lives and I'm being completely left behind. What was also really worrying to see, like from my perspective, when talking to James, and we were in this tiny little room. It was literally fit 2 people and 2 chairs in it. Was the way that he talked about seeing other prisoners go through this period of liminality and time stasis. He said, I see prisoners who are 40 and 50 years old, who still act 20 years old because they don't know any better, because they haven't learned anything new. And in the wider conversation, he talked about it looking like they were frozen in time, but their bodies had just got older. He said it was like they came in and their social, cultural development, it just stopped. And now there's this older person who has this frozen way of life stuck inside. And this really links to the existing literature, really links to the penological literature, where, for example, it says that the feeling of being in stasis while the world moves on only serves to intensify the experience of ageing and fears of physical and mental deterioration. Now I put in here a field note of mine. So I used to keep field notes every time I went into prison to do an interview. During my PhD, I went home and I wrote some field notes about stuff that I knew I would forget, because it was stuff about how it felt and you know, like what was challenging for me. Some of the interviews were really challenging, and some of the ones I've done more recently have been distinctly challenging as well. And in this field note, I said, James seems to be very affected by this, and seeing this had an impact on me personally. He spoke quietly with his head down and his fingers clasped together, moving them irritably as he became a little anxious at times. It appeared that the thought alone of the experience of ageing in prison was enough to make James consider imprisonment more deeply. It was clear that the passing of time was an issue that would remain present in his mind throughout his sentence. So it really had an impact on me seeing this guy, and this really important for me to say. This is not me saying that I'm excusing the behaviour that led him to being in prison. You know, I'm not talking about the criminal justice process, sentencing. That's someone else. I'm interested in the experience of being in prison and what that really means. So I'm not justifying his behaviour or saying he shouldn't have served a prison sentence. But I was really, I remember actually going to the pub that night and actually being really bothered by it still, and saying that to my husband while I was at the bar, at Queen's in fact. I was in Queen's. And yeah, it was really troubling. And I think because he was the same age as me at the time, I was putting myself in that position and thinking how horrendous that would be to know that this was going on. And actually when I was in the pub that night, I kind of felt like I'm in that world that's moving on and those people are stuck in there. And that for me is something that's always troubled me as a prisons researcher, is when you leave prison, you know exactly what they're going to be doing for however long until the next time you see them. And in some cases, I've gone back to prisons and met up with some of the lads that I taught 5 years after. So I know that for that 5 years, I know exactly where they've been, I know where their cells are, and I've been going off into the world and doing all this stuff, and it's something that I find really, really uncomfortable. It's difficult for me to articulate it. So, there's a clip that I wanted to show you. Do I have time? Because I think I'm pretty much done after that. There's a clip that I wanted to show you that I think is really helpful in articulating some of these considerations around time and liminality. And really handily, the illustration's in grey. It's a complete accident, and I actually only realised when I mentioned it to you at lunch. I should have said, oh, it took me ages to find this, it's been so hard to find a grey illustration, like the pains I went through, it just happens that it was grey. So I'm going to press play on this and take a seat, because it's a few minutes long, and then I'm going to come back up to wrap up the session. Okay, so. Come on.
Yes, look, my name's Brett Collins. I would have spent probably of the 10 years I spent in jail at one time, I would have spent, I'd say, probably 5 years of that under solitary confinement. I would pace all the time. I pace for hours from one end to 1, 2, 3, and then always turn towards the same point, 1, 2, 3, to 1, 2, 3, to 1, 2, 3. And so that would be my day in the cell. And then in the yard, I would then run. So I would run, pop, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, up and down the side. And so, so I would ensure that at least the things I could control, I would. Some of the prison officers at times I fixated on doing damage to them, and I didn't, and it isn't my nature. I'm a gentle person, but I started to feel a sense of vengeance and anger. I became more and more sensitive to sounds around me, to the sounds of people walking in the corridors outside. It was I was shaking within a few weeks, and that maintained that I had to learn skills at de-stressing myself that I had never had to deal with before, and had to learn them on the run. I would lie on the floor and then tense myself up as much as I possibly could. So I would start from my head and just tighten my whole body up, and then slowly relax myself and just tighten up again and try and slowly release it with my breathing. So I knew I had to do something to ensure that I had some control. When I was finally released, I was moved into a low security prison, and so as soon as I went into the low security area, I found the interactions between people close to me were just so frightening to me. I couldn't accept the proximity of people beside me. And then eventually I fell in love with this boy. I couldn't believe it. And I remember with absolute delight at discovering that I was actually emotionally alive. I thought that there was a future. I still had a future. I had been married at the time I went to jail, and so I had a young child. But it was a big relief to me as a human being. After such a long period of isolation, I have that reserved. I survived.
So just to add a final point to the talk, and thank you for bearing with me. I said I'll talk like 15 minutes. I was such a gabber, sorry. I think one of the things that I want to highlight, just to finish off this session and to leave you with something that is current and really quite worrying, is a particularly dangerous grey space. So we have a significant number of people still trapped on IPP sentences, which are indeterminate prison sentences for public protection. Now, these sentences were introduced in 2005, I want to say 5 or 6, 5 or 7, and they were actually abolished in 2012. The idea behind these sentences was well intended. It was to be an indeterminate sentence whereby a person could be put in prison for an undetermined period of time because they fell essentially ever so short of being given a life sentence. So a person who was considered to be specifically dangerous or a threat to the public, particularly people who are convicted of sexual and violent offences. But actually in reality, the judicial system got a little bit happy with this new law and were detaining people on IPP sentences who really shouldn't have had them. What's terrifying about this is that people were given tariffs, a minimum amount of time that they were required to spend in prison, and some of them were serving well over that period of time. When I say well over, in some cases a decade. In 2022, an IPP prisoner took his own life. He was initially given a 23-month tariff, so less than 2 years, and 17 years later he took his own life while still stuck in prison on IPP. So what we could argue is that while these sentences, the IPP sentences in particular, can't actually be given in court anymore, we have a group of people, around about 1,000 or just over, who are still trapped on these sentences. We see here the IPP self-inflicted deaths between 2005 and 2022, and you can see where we are right now. So we can see a direct response then from this particular population group to how they're choosing to cope with this sentence, and arguably choice isn't necessarily present, it's a last resort. So potentially we could describe being on an IPP sentence right now as arguably the dangerous grey space of prison. So it's really bugging whether it's 2005 or 7. I think it was 5. It was 5. Oh, it was 5. It was introduced by the Criminal Justice Act 2003, but didn't come into force until 2005. There we go. Brain switched on. I know my grey matter. It's because I'm still thinking about that sandwich I enjoyed at lunchtime. So yeah, thank you so much for bearing with me, and I welcome any questions, particularly about Salvador Dali. I know all about Salvador Dali. But yeah, any questions you might have about prisons research, prisons grey spaces, you're very welcome. So thank you very much for your time. Cheers.
That's fantastic, thank you. It kind of raised so many things that made me think about the work again as well in different ways. So that sense of the time taken in making these paintings, it was kind of a very repetitive, slow, kind of a lot of painting, priming the canvas, and then sanding it back, painting again, sanding it back. So it's this kind of like this idea of labour being the grey space as well.
Yeah.
But, yeah, that was really fantastic. Thank you very much. It's just kind of really interesting to think about how the work can prompt different discussions. So, kind of, I know as well when we went to the prison,
Yeah.
one of the things that was interesting was about how the process of making work for them
Yes.
gave them that sense of structure. You've also got, in making work, these moments of waiting. You can't go back to the piece.
Yeah, yeah.
A, because you can't go back to the classroom, but also for all makers, there are stages where something is drying,
Yeah.
or you're gathering new information to include. And that felt like
I think, yeah, I think one of the things that I find really difficult to imagine about the prison art space, like you said, is space that you're removed from, and as an academic, I suppose my equivalent of that is if I'm in the writing space, so if I'm in a writing mindset, the thought of somebody actually then hoiking me out and saying, okay, stop, and then telling me when I can go back into that is so difficult. So it's really hard to understand how the way that prisons are currently designed and the way they're regulated can be conducive to a full sense of creativity, because time is so crucial to that creativity, and ownership and control over time is crucial to creativity. And one of the things that we know about time in prison is that you have low ownership and low control, and so people who are able to produce artistic work in prison, they're doing it under conditions that aren't conducive to that, and actually arguably stifle creativity. So when you see it, it's amazing.
yeah, fantastic work.
Yeah.
And that is the next show to be coming to Hull University. So
Yes.
we'll hope you keep coming back as audiences.
Yeah, come back. 7th of June, open to the public. HMP Hull Prisoner Artwork.
And also that sort of sense, something you touched on as well, was the waiting room, and that sort of position of being in limbo, and that made me again think about making work, but also reviewing work between kind of this knowing and not knowing. Sort of the idea of the bus stop, where you've left your home, but you're not on the journey yet, or you've not arrived yet.
And I think again there's the additional layers in prison, because when you're in that, so I suppose the prison is a liminal space in itself. There are liminal spaces within it, and one of those liminal spaces is the reception area, which is like the waiting room equivalent. But that's also the space where you are physically stripped of your identity, not just because you are, given your possessions, but the processes that you go through. Emily and I were recently at a high security prison, and we played a game of looking at X-rays in the induction centre, and looking at X-rays and guess what we found in this person. So we were looking at the X-rays and trying to work out, well, first of all, how the person who put a screw up there is all right. Looked like a very pointy one as well. But that process, it reminds you of physically being scanned as you go in. Like there was a giant scanner. So you go through a stripping down process, like with the painting stripping back thing before you can then rebuild. Yeah. It's the stripping back of the person, but in a way that is humiliating, but it's necessary. So how do you create an environment that is safe and secure, but also still has a sense of humanity and is not humiliating? It's impossible. But the stripping back thing, the preparation thing, like we saw with the canvases in the prison, is like how the prisoner is stripped back and prepared to be a good prisoner.
To be a good prisoner, and then ultimately to be a good member of society.
I'm going to say to be a good prisoner. To hopefully be a good prisoner, but not too much of a good prisoner so they get used to it.
I want to keep coming back.
No.
I guess there is that thing of the comfort of return to somewhere where there is that, what's going to happen.
Absolutely,
to you. That
well,
sort of institutionalisation.
Security.
A little like academics and college.
Absolutely. We're just students if we've got to leave.
Exactly. We just want to keep being there, don't we?
We just look around. But again, it's that reliance on what you know, even if you don't like it. So with artists, it might be over-reliance on a certain kind of medium because you've mastered it. even though you know each other, you try and push your boundaries. You could say the same about institutions that we treat in the same way. We go back to them because we know that it's not necessarily good for us, but we get a lot of comfort in knowledge. And so that could be, you know, through things we're interested in, and we just stay in that zone, like me in prisons. But yeah.
But also it's that kind of grey space of not knowing that you talked about, and that kind of how actually that can be quite an exciting place as well, if it's somewhere where perhaps there is a growing out of or a growing through. So
definitely, yeah. And I think that's something we saw in the art room, where there was the chap who was trying to use charcoal, and he was very good at it. And the not knowing was, I don't know if this is going to work, but he was doing that in an environment where it was okay to not know. Mm-hmm. So I suppose there are some places of sanctuary within the prison space, like the art room, like the library, where actually not knowing is all right, temporarily. So you can achieve kind of pockets of that excitement of not knowing, but only pockets, and only temporary pockets. So yeah.
Do we have any questions in the room for her? Oh, at the back. I think Paul was first.
Yeah, sort of technical question. The IPP, that interested me, this imprisonment for public protection.
Yeah.
Is that data just for the UK, or is it a global one? And if it is for the UK, are there any demographics of who and why they would put on this IPP? Because my own feeling is that our whole society now is becoming a liminal space, as you say, about social constructs, but economically they've gone, but even more politically they're kind of being demanded as well.
Yeah.
So, speaking personally, a person that was heading to this retirement zone, TEDx talks are great for the 4 stages of retirement and your guidance, but overall it seems that, well, I'm sorry, but anything can happen, or you may have to work even longer and pay taxes even longer.
Exactly, and I mean, it's looking at IPP sentences is almost like, it did seem like an extreme example of uncertainty, but I think certainly, you know, post-pandemic, we're totally different people now, because we've been overexposed to uncertainty that we wouldn't ever be usually exposed to, and we don't operate well when we're uncertain, as much as I think we like surprise and excitement and unpredictability. Generally we don't work very well when we don't know what's going to happen. In terms of the data, that is just from this country. Typically men in their early 20s were given these kinds of sentences because they were typically for violent offences, not always for violent offences. But as a criminologist, the thing that we know about crime is that age is the best indicator for understanding or predicting whether a person will commit crime. So we know that people naturally age out of crime anyway. We know that, that's been in print since the 1940s. We know that is the best predictor, and there is a perfect bell curve when it comes to the peak of when a person is most likely and then least likely, and it's slightly different for male and female, but generally speaking, by the time a person reaches kind of 30, late 30s, 40s, it's kind of not out of their system, but the likelihood, if they haven't already engaged in crime at that point, is really unlikely. But also people mature out of it, because thankfully we're not the same as we used to be. I don't like to think what I was like when I was like 14. Thank God we age and we change. And IPP sentences don't account for any of those things, because there's the kind of assumption, or our justice system has this assumption that bad people exist, which is just crazy. I mean, people do bad stuff, people do bad things, but even in high security prisons, I would honestly say there's probably 2 occasions of 2 people I've met who have really stumped me in terms of being able to identify some kind of humanity. And you know, in high security prison, we're talking about people who are either convicted of murder, multiple murder, terror offences, or high profile drug trafficking. So people who have done the worst offences and are given the longest sentences. It's difficult. I found it difficult to find somebody or meet people who I'm stumped by in that sense, that I can't see some good in there, whether that's skill, talent, intent, communication or whatever. So these sentences don't account for any of the kind of human elements of who people are. And as I mentioned in the talk, this is not me excusing behaviour. I think, and also prison abolitionists would hate me for this. I'm not a prison abolitionist. I think prisons have a place in society, but I think the way they are now is completely unrealistic and unreasonable. They are bad places, they don't work, and the sentences in that respect are only adding to that. Going to answer any of the question, but I rambled a bit.
We spoke about the remand prison being the most troubled point in prison because the prisoners are still waiting their sentence. They don't know, and I guess the IPP is like a permanent remand. You're not working to the resolution or to the end. So there's no point when you're rehabilitated. You're constantly in that limbo.
That's the thing, when you're talking to people, even people who serve it, so that one of my latest co-authors, Ryan Peace, published next month, he's in prison serving a life sentence. He was given, I think, 35 years in total. He was a student of mine in high security prison, and we've since become collaborators. And he never ever talks about uncertainty. Or he knows how long his sentence is because he's got a length. He knows what the process is. So it's not about people necessarily disagreeing with the sentence they've been given. It's the uncertain element that makes it so brutal and so inhumane. And you know that those instances of suicide are where people they just can't cope with the uncertainty anymore. And I guess the pandemic gave us a tiny glimpse of that. A lot of people said during the pandemic, now we know what it's like to be in prison. No, we don't at all. It's ridiculous. But I think it definitely gave us an insight into the uncomfort of uncertainty in a much more acute way, which I think goes some way to understanding certain kinds of sentences.
I think in terms of like COVID, people could cope with the restriction, but it's not knowing how long it's going to go on.
As long as we know what to do, we might not like it, but we know. It's when we don't. It's when we don't know, and it's that really captures the essence of those particularly problematic sentences and the people still trapped on them in another existing life.
Jill, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I was going to reflect as well on the IPP's sentences, I've talked to a lot of prisoners who are in that situation. And it is heartbreaking. I suppose I was going to reflect that that's like a liminal space or a limbo space within a process. So it's not they're in a justice system, but they're in a box where things don't make sense, where things are unjust, where they've just been left or forgotten in a vacuum. So it's a limbo in limbo.
It is, and no matter how long you sit and think about it, there is no way you can kind of logically come up with a way to create any kind of certainty or any kind of measurement. I remember the first time I met somebody serving an IPP sentence. I was in Leeds prison, and I was sat in his cell. I was sat on his bed actually next to him while he was having a counselling session with his listener. So the listener system is a scheme set up by the Samaritans, and they train prisoners to become peer mentors. So he was sat with his listener, and I mean, I was shocked that they invited me to come in because that's a really private moment. But I was sat with him on the bed, and he was talking to his listener about how difficult he was finding exactly what I've been talking about, like the uncertainty, just not knowing what's going to happen. And then he was showing me the pictures on his wall, and his daughter had been born just before he went to prison. And actually, the only time marker he had was the pictures on the wall, and he had them in order, and he was showing me them, and you could literally see her growing up, and all of that is a constant reminder of of time that can't be recaptured. So that the essence of time punishment, exactly that was there in visual. But he was absolutely distraught because even though he was able to have those markers, the uncertainty of not knowing when he would get out, it just destroyed all of that. So
he's not in the system, but it makes sense. So it can't appeal against this or change that.
No. It doesn't make sense. And like I said, I think, you know, the system needs to be fair and just, and I think there is a place for
the first time
prison
talking
over.
about it, I didn't believe it.
Yeah.
Like, I can't do, went home, Googled it, and looked it up.
Yeah.
But, you know,
Well, if you want, I'm going to throw Emily under the bus, but if you want insight into some of the MP's decision-making processes around that time, Emily's doing her PhD at the moment, looking at the over-politicisation of prisons, and she's had some incredible insight into what was going on at that time politically from those people in politics. And so we've been hearing about some of those decisions, how they were made, why they were made.
and weren't some of the original politicians, haven't they, gone back and said this is ridiculous?
Yeah.
It shouldn't have happened, you know?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. Because it wasn't used in the way that it was intended to be used. It was intended to be used sparingly in kind of an emergency situation where someone falls between the gap of, well, they don't quite qualify for a life sentence, but they have a proven capacity for dangerousness.
Yeah.
And so it was very much for public protection. So it was supposed to be used in very unique circumstances, and there were criteria set out. But that's not how they were used. They were just given out like sweets. And I guess we could go into the makeup of the judiciary being male, pale, and from certain echelons of society, but we won't go into that. So yeah, it was a massive mock-up basically. Yeah.
We're going to, I think, pull this part together now, and then we're going to have a short, just a couple of minutes comfort break while y'all get set up, and then we'll be having that performance. But just on a close, I think the thing that it's brought me back to again is that Paul would always have said that these paintings, the grey was not devoid of colour, but actually the grey contained all the colour, but it just seems like the colour's not there and the colour's happening all around it. And that kind of like has been what I've been thinking when you've been talking about the prison. All of colour and all of life is there, but it just feels like it's a lens where everything is going on around it.
There's also a connection there to be made about the things that are hidden. So I've just written an article for the Yorkshire Post, I think they might not publish it, I don't know, about art in prison and about the exhibition coming up. And the way that you talked then about grey having all the colour but it's just not visible, you could use that as a way to kind of explain how there are an array of hidden talents within our prison population. They're just not visible because they're overshadowed by the grey space.
Yeah.
Like when you go into the art room and you're like, wow, this is amazing. Or when I have taught and have met the most natural, gifted, critical thinkers I've ever met. So that the colours are all there if we think about it in terms of skills, competencies, talent, etc. But they're overshadowed by the fact that the grey space overtakes it. So it can be a good thing, but then in that context it can be a negative thing as well. So it really helps me to articulate things using imagery. So yeah, it'd be great.
And hopefully within that grey space then potentially identify those kind of key markers of who they are and the potential.
Yeah, definitely.
All the potential in the grey.
Yes, exactly.
Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much. That was fantastic. Really
That sunny afternoon desert of stupid frivolity. Scientists believe they have unlocked consciousness. It's behind a paywall. That sunny afternoon desert of stupid frivolity. I'm not surprised. Mysterious prestige. Scientists believe they have unlocked consciousness. It's behind. It's behind a paywall. It's behind a. That sunny afternoon, that desert of stupid frivolity. I'm not surprised. Mysterious prestige, forever chemicals. Scientists believe that sunny afternoon desert of stupid frivolity, forever chemicals aren't as romantic as they sound. That sunny afternoon, desert of stupid frivolity, that forever chemicals scientist behind a paywall. Safe asbestos, that sunny afternoon. Desert of stupid forever chemical scientists believe they have unlocked consciousness. It's behind a paywall. It's sunny not surprised. Mysterious prestige. Scientists believe they have unlocked consciousness. It's behind a paywall. It's forever chemicals, safe asbestos that sunny afternoon. Most of us can't afford ghosts these days. The end goal of evolution is... The end goal is, scientists believe, the end goal is forever chemicals. The end goal is that sunny afternoon. That end goal is adequate parking, safe asbestos now. That's some relatable content right there. It's behind the paywall. It's that sunny afternoon, that desert of stupid frivolity. It's behind a paywall, adequate parking, end goal of evolution. It's